Welcome, everybody. Welcome to my live stream. My name's Doug Fink, and for folks who don't know me, I'm a 16-time Microsoft MVP. I do these live streams on technology, more focused on PowerShell and AI. I ported the Python SDK to PowerShell, and have had a great time over the last. I ported it 3 times actually, and I'm going to port a 4th time, especially with the announcements over the last day or so. And we're going to today hear about Evan's new company, GenSX. Um, but before we do that, just in May, we're going to be doing another watch party in person at one of the Microsoft buildings down on 18th Street. So if you're in New York, head back to the RSVP page. You can join up through there. We're going to have lunch and whatnot, a whole bunch of MVPs, a whole bunch of people from different parts of the industry there. So it's a great place to do some networking, great place to hear about the what the keynote's going to be, and then we'll all be discussing stuff as we go. So it should be a lot of fun. Um, I'm going to drop the link into this chat. This is for if you want to head over there, you can hit subscribe, notification, and this is where I'll post today's video. Awesome. So Evan, welcome and thank you for joining. I think you on mute.
Thanks so much for having me, Doug. Wonderful to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I know Evan. I don't know him. I started following him when, I followed people like Joe Duffy and Luke Hoban, and I saw that they came up with this thing called Pulumi years ago. And I was one of the first people one of the people at Morgan, and I was like, oh, I was talking to my boss saying this new Pulumi stuff looks great. And he was like, yeah, we're not going to go with a new product. And a couple of days later, he said, hey, I heard that Morgan just invested a bunch of money with Pulumi. He goes, looks like you're up. And I'm like, what do you mean? And that became a whole interesting process. But I followed a lot of the players inside of Pulumi, Evan being one of them, Dan being another. And then I think a few weeks ago, I've been lurking around Evan's repos. And then a few weeks ago, a month ago, whatever it was, I saw him post GenSX. And I was like, ooh, this looks really cool. And then he did something at the AI Tinkerers stuff out in Seattle. And he did a presentation and a demo. And I was like, oh, wow, that'd be great to see. So here he is today. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself, your company, and jump into the demo when you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Evan. I have a background in cloud infrastructure and developer tools. Got my start early in Azure. Have worked at other big tech companies and startups in Seattle, but most recently spent 5 years at Pulumi. Joined as a very early engineer, and eventually as the company grew, was leading the engineering team. Yeah, I love infra. I love dev tools. And these days I'm really loving AI. And JetSX is a company that we started, and we're building an open source framework and soon to be durable execution runtime for building agents and orchestrating LLM workflows.
Excellent. So I know we're going to jump into the demo in a bit, but it's amazing. I think we talked a couple of weeks ago. We were like, well, hey, what are we going to talk about? And I think even just with the last couple of days, there's been some really cool announcements from OpenAI as well as Microsoft and Anders Hejlsberg saying, hey, we're going to take TypeScript, make a native Go program that can compile it. Um, Fascinating times. I think we're going to start seeing daily drops of amazing things, go from
Yeah.
weekly to daily. I don't know what I'm going to do in terms of sleep, but so I wanted to get your insight on, this whole Go TypeScript. Any thoughts that you might have or insights you may give?
Yeah. So I think my understanding of the whole situation is that just kind of accidentally, the style that the existing TypeScript code base is written in very closely mimics Go. And if you think about a project like TypeScript, there are millions of developers that depend on it, and billions or even more lines of code that depend on like very specific behaviors, right? You could think about you think about what the TypeScript compiler does. It parses a bunch of text, builds an AST, accumulates a bunch of types, and there could be, for any given circumstance, multiple candidates for a type. Like you write some complex code, and the compiler at the end of the day has to decide what is the type of this thing. And there may be three, four, five types that are equally valid. And the behavior of like which one gets picked, is it the first one? Is it the last one? Is it sorted by alphabetical order? Like that behavior starts to really matter, right? It's kind of like this undefined behavior that becomes a feature. Because if you change that ordering, then now you might break the code of like millions and millions of code bases. And
Like
so,
Visual Studio Code, right?
yeah, yeah. And so it was never, it was never really on the table for TypeScript to do like a full rewrite, right? And so my understanding is that their aim was to do a port. And the selection criteria for picking a language was like one, what could the code base, most cleanly be mapped to using the existing kind of programming patterns and paradigms and like, structure to maintain that one-to-one behavior across all of these like undefined areas. And two, what is going to be performant? Like what's going to lead to that 10x performance improvement?
Fascinating. And it's interesting that Anders actually chose Go, or maybe it was a consensus.
No, yeah, I
'Cause-
mean, my understanding is that like the way that the TypeScript code base is written actually looks a lot like Go, and so it was a very, very natural pick.
so one of the things that I like, since I'm a Microsoft MVP and whatnot and a .NET person, so people are saying they see a black screen. Do you see a black screen with me, or with
I
just
see I
Evan, or
see you're
total?
you're sharing your screen with like it's like a kind of horizontal dark blue kind of background. Maybe it's just your desktop or something.
Okay, let me sorry about that. Let's try technology already playing. Let's see. Stop share. You want to share your screen and then Bubble continue talking?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. And I saw someone in the comments asked for let's see. Here we go. Someone asked for a link to the blog post and the self-modifying code agent. URL is up here. If you happen to want to start doing a little bit of pre-reading, we're going to walk through this really soon and run it and see what happens. But this has links to the GitHub repo and all the code and all those sorts of things too. So,
Cool. Yeah, so I've been thinking like I'm
oh,
gonna probably
actually, this
post it.
is this is
Oh,
the wrong blog. Here we go. This is
there
the
you
right
go.
one. Yeah.
So I was going to start poking people today and posting out things like if you're coding C sharp, pivot to Go. So I'm just wondering, you know, TypeScript looks like I mean, I even just saw like with OpenAI dropping their new response and agent SDKs yesterday, somebody early access people to OpenAI have already ported it to TypeScript.
Hmm.
So I mean, have any insights or points on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, we did some prototyping on the responses API last night, including like using computer use, which was pretty fun. My initial impressions on computer use is that OpenAI's implementation is like is fairly slow and has some bugs. Like it doesn't seem like it's quite ready for prime time. I've heard very, very good things about browser use. That project has absolutely taken off. But so I don't think OpenAI is quite there yet. I think this idea of like stateful agents, right? Agents that can maintain response history, so you don't have to do that in your database, is a great idea. I think everybody loves this idea. What I've come to learn through building like agents in production, like before we were working on this open source project, we actually worked for 9 months building very complex agents that wrote like developer documentation and did marketing automation for software companies. And so we wrote agents that would run for 5+ minutes, make thousands of LLM calls. That's actually how we ended up building GenSX, was to solve our own problems with existing frameworks that we were using that were really slowing us down. But I think like that experience taught me that like abstraction is generally a very, very bad thing when you're building an LLM application. It's like very abstracted frameworks are great to take you from like 0 to 1, but very quickly you want to customize the details of how that works. And when we've done things like, quote unquote memory, typically you don't want to do that at a chat completion level, right? You might want to you want to understand what was the previous sort of user input and what was the output. But all of that intermediate, tool calling, all that data, all of the data on, like the original system message, even like when a new user message comes in, you might want to select a completely different system message. And so, in my opinion, it's a nice thing to play with and build on top of, but the level of abstraction is not quite right. And I also think that you lose out a little bit because now you're extremely locked into OpenAI. And so if new DeepSeek model comes out or new Qwen model comes out, all of your code base depends on this sort of message history abstraction and responses. You're locked out of using those models now.
Gotcha. Absolutely. So what brought you to what got you when did you first learn about AI in the new version, not the winters? But
Yeah.
and what got you excited and got you addicted?
Yeah, what got me excited actually was this project here, Plumi AI. And so right after, GPT 3.5 came out, a couple folks at the team prototyped this. This was like one of the first like websites on the internet that did, natural language translation into code. And so this one translates like into infrastructure code. So I can say like, give me a static website behind, CloudFront, and this will spit out the Pulumi code in whatever language I ask for. And so a lot of work and effort went into this before, Claude and the other, models could kind of one-shot this sort of stuff. This one's pretty cool because it integrates with Pulumi's entire sort of like schema. So it knows about the long tail of 200,000 cloud resources, even if there aren't examples out there online. But this is where I really got started and hooked on AI.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I remember when you folks published it, I was like very impressed. And then I was watching Luke was actually somehow, for some reason, putting stuff on his repos. And I was looking at the his prompts. And I'm like,
Yeah.
where did he get that one? I'm like, that's definitely from behind the curtain. And not that it was like any super special stuff, but I could tell from the prompt, it was like, yeah, that's not a usual prompt. So yeah. And some of the stuff I saw inside the Pulumi AI was just really slick. So
Yeah,
so that's what got you going. Cool.
that's what got me hooked. Yeah.
Yeah, so now we have Claude Code coming out, and then it's getting. Of course, they're all going to get. This the sodas changing on a daily, weekly basis are just something I expect to happen. But there are some really cool pieces that come along with Ada, Claude Code, and whatnot. And
Yeah,
I just see this being off the rails by the end of the year. What's going to be
absolutely.
possible? Cool. So, what would you have to say to what kind of objections do you get to this, and how do you work with them? What are your
Yeah,
response?
I think maybe it would be worth giving folks kind of an introduction to the programming model. I didn't believe that the world needed, the 31st graph-based agent framework. And I also personally don't believe that graph-based APIs are like intuitive or optimized for humans. It's really like a machine concept. And so I wanted to create something that was like far more expressive and focused on composition over abstraction, and also used a programming pattern that like the majority of developers have actually spent a lot of time with. Um, I don't know if this is going to be, super familiar to the PowerShell sort of folks. Certainly, composition over abstraction is like a big theme in PowerShell, so I think folks will be able to appreciate that. But GenSX is focused on building agents and workflows with React-like components. And it's not React, but it does use some similar syntax. It's a workflow library and engine that runs on the back end. So you would run this code inside of your like Express server or in a Node.js application. And when you build an agent or a workflow with GenSX, you use components. And a component is pretty simple. It has, input props, it has an output type, and then it has a peer function that produces a value, right? So in this case, this produces another component. So components can return other components, or you could make an API call and return like the JSON result. But the framework will take care of kind of recursively resolving any components that get returned. So this is just the simple, blog
And
editing
can I just
example.
interject that that looks a lot
Yeah,
like Lisp. That looks a lot like Lisp to me.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you agree or, I mean, it's clearly not, but if
Yeah, I mean, it is all about data flow at the end of the
cool.
day.
Okay.
And so yeah, so we have, this component with a simple prompt. You're a technical writer. A lot of our examples are along those lines because that's kind of where we started. So write a draft about this blog post that the user wants to write, and then return an OpenAI compatible chat completion. And you'll notice that this is just the full OpenAI API. Like, we really don't believe in abstraction. We give you like full access to everything under the hood. And then the beautiful thing about these components is because they're pure functions, they're reusable across your code base. You can publish them to NPM. It's very common that you'll have multiple workflows or sort of multiple modalities that you're working across. And a lot of the existing frameworks use kind of global state within your workflow that makes it really, really hard to share code if you're not careful. And so when you want to compose components together inside of a workflow, you can do what's called nested child function. So we have, this research component right here that produces some research. And using this child function, we can get access to the output of the parent component, well typed, and resolved to like a plain prompt value. So, this component actually produces a promise, and the framework takes care of like resolving that into a prompt value that's ready to use. And then we can explicitly pass that dependency into the next step. So we do our research, we write our draft, and then finally we edit our draft. And the nice thing about this is you get a mix of declarative code that's like very easy to read, very easy to see how your dependencies flow through each step. But your code is also completely dynamic because you can write JavaScript inside of here. You can write JavaScript and TypeScript inside of your component implementations. So you really get the best of both worlds.
Cool. Mm.
Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, I would say, there are some other kind of examples inside of here. Like if I go over to the docs, kind of the existing state of the art for agent frameworks is that they use these node edge graph builders, right? So you declare a graph and then, kind of imperatively add a bunch of nodes to it. So this one's like, collecting Hacker News stories and then going to analyze the posts and analyze the trends and edit the post, write a tweet. But it's very hard for me at least to read this code and understand what it does. It's like I actually, almost need to go up to this whiteboard and start scribbling out like, what are all the nodes? How do the edges connect together? And so I find it to be very difficult to work with.
You
As
use
opposed
whiteboards for
to,
that? You don't just drop that into Chat GPT and ask for a mermaid diagram? I'm only kidding.
you
Whatever
can
you
do
want.
that. You can do that as well. Yeah, whatever floats your boat. I've
So where
definitely
do you
done that
see
before.
like other tools or other agent? And I'm not talking about just Crew AI or LangChain, but like
Hmm.
some of them actually build agents and they give tools to agents and then they build agents into teams. And that's kind of something that OpenAI is going towards. I don't know, if that's like I don't like I've
Yeah,
seen the nodes and the
I
edges. I'm like I'm out of that game a long time ago. So
well, I think the interesting thing is that you can give it a different vocabulary, right? You can say like, oh, you can humanize a little bit and say, oh, this is a team, and this team talks to
mm,
that team, and this team does triage, handing off to this team. But at the end of the day, you're still constructing a graph. It's still an API where you're statically constructing a graph. Um, and so, personally, I find this code to be a lot easier to read, a lot easier to debug. Like dependencies are much cleaner. And the reason why we typically reach for graph APIs when building agents is because we do things like reflection, right? You might have an agent that produces an output, an agent that evaluates that output, and then if it doesn't meet a certain score or threshold, you want to run through it again and continue that process until your score is met, and then you can exit the cycle. And it turns out that, JSX and the React like programming model, people think about rendering trees, but the key part here is that you can render your tree programmatically, right? You can programmatically at runtime choose what nodes get inserted. So this is an example of, something that might do kind of reflection, for instance. So we have an agent workflow that runs an agent step and then takes that result and checks, this output property needs more work. And so if the result needs more work, we can recurse programmatically into the agent workflow again. And now you have a cycle that's much easier to reason about and read. The code's much easier to read. So all of the same patterns are possible in a much more expressive way that doesn't require you to use this static graph API. And agents, in my opinion, are all about like dynamic control flow and decision making at runtime, which is a big problem when you have to define your graph up front in the program. Like when you can actually run your agent, do structured output, look at properties of that structured output, and then decide programmatically, how do I want to go next? It's a whole lot more powerful and expressive.
Cool. Interesting. Well, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. Plenty of people on board here to answer them, including Evan.
Yeah.
That was a good workthrough for me. I don't know about other
Yeah.
folks. Touching on patterns and workflows. And like you said, composition. I think I mentioned when you wrote that, I was like, oh, that takes me back to the Gang of 4 days.
Yeah,
So
for
that's a
sure.
concept that's been around even in architecture building for buildings, right? So that composition gets
Absolutely.
you the real capability. So I like that.
So, I'm curious, maybe a little bit of audience participation. I have the self-modifying code like agent. I want to run that, but that is like a 4,000 level demo. It's like a fairly complex one. I thought maybe it would be fun to see like a simple demo first. Like I have a demo that analyzes the front page of Hacker News. Like maybe we should start by looking at that. Is that okay with folks?
Type of one in the chat if you're up for that. Type of two if you'd rather go deep.
All right, one, let's do it. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So, let me open a new terminal here uh,
And so I'm assuming
ooh,
I see your Anthropic provider, so I'm sure that you hit all the different providers and models that are out there.
absolutely. We hit everything. Um, and so yeah, so this is our Hacker News analyzer. It crawls like the top 500 posts from the front page of Hacker News, runs sentiment analysis, and does a summary over every single post. It'll do sentiment analysis over all the comments, and then writes us a report on kind of like what is the current zeitgeist, right? What are the top three positive trends, top three negative trends, and then the top three surprising trends. And then, just for fun, we edit it in the style of Paul Graham, and then finally like write a tweet in the style of Paul Graham as well. Um, and so I'll go ahead and pop this open and run it. And we're currently connected to sort of like our GenSX like backend. I have an API key set up. And so this is going to give us like tracing and visualization as the workflow executes. So you can see we're running this analyze Hacker News step, and you can see all of the components that are executing a analyze component and a summary component that's running for every post. So if I crack one of these open, I can see all of the raw OpenAI chat completion that's going on here. I can see, the complete sort of like usage. I can see all the tokens that were used. I can see all of the context that was given, the user message, the system message, and then the output as well. So like this gives you a really great way. Like everybody knows when you're working on LLM workflows that run for 2 minutes, you don't sit there and set a breakpoint and wait for it to hit. You don't wait 1 minute for your breakpoint to hit. You run the workflow and then you come back afterwards and figure out what happened. So if I collapse this down, we can see we've generated the report. Now we're editing the report in style Paul Graham. We can take a look at this real quick. So audio experiences in gaming, simplifying container orchestration, AI-driven education tools, negative themes, privacy concerns with AI and social media. I feel like this one probably comes up any day of the week that you run this analyzer. Complexity in software tools, AI and legacy systems, very cool. And so while that finishes running, like let's go ahead and look through, a little bit of the code, and I'll show you kind of one of my favorite examples that really shows you the expressiveness of being able to mix kind of these declarative components with like imperative code. And so this component does our analysis over those 500 posts. So it takes in that list of 500 stories and then just runs plain array.mat. And so in parallel, we're going to run like 1,000 LLM calls. We're going to generate a summary for each post and a comment for each post. You can see like we're within this array.map, we're returning an object where the values in that object are actually components. And the framework is going to take care of resolving all of those components for us. And so this component is, just a simple kind of prompt, injects a little bit of context, and then returns an OpenAI chat completion. And so in, just about 5 lines of code, we have, MapReduce. And if you tried to write something like this in a graph-based framework, it would be pages and pages and pages of code.
Cool. So so the actual piece that um, curates or pulls out all the posts, is that a component that you wrote, or you're just using some libraries? Do you have those set up as
Yeah, yeah. So
tools and components that
So if
everybody
you
else
if
can
you look at
use?
the fetch, this basically just uses the Hacker News, like they have a Firebase API
Yeah.
that they
Okay.
expose.
Cool.
And so we have like just a little API client that we wrote that's like in another file. And so, yeah, this is an example of a component that just returns like some JSON, basically, right? Like returns an array of stories. And you can even see that in this like fetch HN post step. I have like all of the stories here that got returned, and I can see, the ID, title, text. I can see like the full JSON of that post if I want to copy it and go do something with it. So it's really nice that like
Nice.
the inputs and outputs of every step of your workflow are captured. And we also have like secrets masking too. So you can choose like right here, I have my OpenAI provider that provides credentials to everything in the graph, and my API key is redacted. So you can choose to trim out what gets captured in both your inputs and your outputs.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how many other out of the box type things like the Hacker News do you have a set of components for that, or you expect every, users to do that
Yeah.
on
Good.
their own, or?
Good question. So we have a ton of out of the box stuff. We have like an Anthropic client. We have support for running, turning MCP servers into tools. Open Router, Vercel AI SDK. The Vercel AI SDK component lets you. Oh, sorry. Are you froze there for a minute? You still hear me?
I can hear you. Or can you hear
Okay,
me?
I can hear
All
you.
right.
Yep. The
Okay.
Vercel AI SDK lets you use any model, and our OpenAI client is also like OpenAI compatible. So you can use Perplexity, any other sort of model. Um, yeah,
Cool. Cool.
yeah,
And it's not too hard, I guess, to write. Yeah, like I see I call them tools, but I see like the Hacker News stuff. There are people that have wired their stuff up to DuckDB and whatnot, and they use the schemas so they can do all kinds of queries against it, which I
yep.
think is really cool. So uh, it's
Super easy. Yeah, we have
yeah,
examples of using like Firecrawl, TurboPuffer, vector databases, all that sort of stuff. And it's
it's
really lightweight to turn this stuff into a component. It was about, I don't know, 5 minutes of work to add support for the OpenAI Responses API last night after the example came out.
nice.
Yeah,
So should we all pivot to
yeah.
TypeScript?
Let's. Oh, sure. Or the self-modifying code demo or TypeScript.
Well, I'm up for the stuff, but I'm also
Oh,
wondering, like, as coders, like, obviously a lot of coders or people trying to embrace LLMs and trying to get their head around get their heads around the psychology, how do they work, and what language do you use, right? And
yeah,
especially now, and I want to reflect back on the, Anders announcement,
yeah.
which is already sending shockwaves through the community as expected. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
get your, go down that path again, a little bit more of your insight.
Yeah, I would say um, LLMs are really there's a lot of TypeScript code out there and JavaScript. When you look at like the Hacker News surveys of like what programming languages people are writing, they usually break out TypeScript and JavaScript into separate buckets, and it's usually like TypeScript, Python, JavaScript, or sometimes it's Python, TypeScript, JavaScript. But when you add those two buckets together, there's like twice as many JavaScript developers as there are Python developers out there. So there's a lot of code for these models to train on top of. And I would say like a type safe language like JavaScript, Python can be type safe if you add on sort of bits and pieces and libraries and type checking libraries. But LLMs are really good at reasoning about type safe languages. So I found that like Claude and other models are just so much better at TypeScript than any other language. So I think that's a huge reason to pick TypeScript, out of the box. And then, LLMs aside, I've always loved being able to work in one language and do everything that I've needed to be able to do. I can, build front end code. I can build back end APIs. Like if I really, really have something that's super performance critical, I can always carve that out into like a Go microservice or something like that. But you can get an awful long way on, Node.js. And most people never hit that level of scale where it really matters. And so the benefits of being on a team where everyone can work on every part of the code base are huge, in my opinion.
That's great. And I think interesting to me from Anders' discussion, giving APIs into the compiler and making it easier for LSPs to work with TypeScript going forward. I think we're going to see some really awesome tooling coming out of Microsoft. And
Yeah,
their stuff's going to be they're going to work it in PyCharm and JetBrains and all that. So people are going to really push the limits. So generating this kind of stuff, it's going to be at a point where it doesn't matter what language you're in. It's really understanding and how to interact with LLMs and how to make your workflow better and more automated in that
yeah,
reasoning space, I think.
right.
Cool. So what you want to take us through some self-modifying code?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is, this stuff is science fiction, right? Like what if we could build an agent that could like change its own code and self-replicate and evolve, right? So
Sounds
before we
like
jump into the
sounds
code,
like CRISPR technology.
yeah, right.
It's a little
little bit
genetic
of little
work.
bit of Skynet mixed in there. So um, I just want to start with this diagram because the example itself is like pretty meaty. And so we start our agent over here on the left, and then we take like a code snapshot, right? Like the existing code that the agent is running. And in our case, the way that we accomplish that is by basically cloning the repo. So, the agent lives inside of a repo, and our first step is going to be cloning that code down into a temporary directory, and that's like the agent's workspace, right? So, once we have that workspace, the agent we first have like a goal setting step, right? A planning step where we give the agent access to a bunch of tools so that it can read through the code base, read through history of like previous operations that it tried to run, some that may have been successful, some that may have not been successful, and then it independently comes up with its own goal. Like we could give it a goal if we wanted to, but it's a whole lot more fun to just let the agent decide, hey, how do I want to change my own code, right?
Exactly. So when you
And then
talk about planning steps and that kind of stuff, that takes me back to Andrew Ng, and I think there was I don't know if it was a paper in 24, early 24 or late 23, where he was starting to talk about, you can take your chatbots up the next level by giving it a couple of agents that, check what the outcome. If the outcome's not exactly what they want, keep prompting. But then there's the planning and the reflection steps, which was not quite fleshed out at that point. Is
yeah,
that what your mindset is about on the research that was done, or
yeah.
you just
So
came on it on
so
your own?
he so I think this is often referred to as like chain of thought, which is what kind of what the reasoning and thinking models try to do. But what I would say is that LLMs operating on smaller tasks usually do a better job. And so as you can usually start with, maybe one agent that has a set of tools, or you can set with one prompt that's going to, do multiple tasks or has, a boatload of instructions. But as you run into edge cases and you want to start building evals and driving quality up, I found that like that process of taking like think about how would you approach this problem, right? And then break that down into a discrete set of steps that is your LLM workflow.
Right.
And so we've definitely seen success with that.
Yeah. I
What
often
does
talk
the
about
test
that,
about? Oh,
like
sorry, go ahead.
if you make a cake, you don't just walk up to a bowl and start adding eggs and flour and baking soda and water and crust and whipped cream and the cherry, and then you go, oh, all right, make a cake. Doing it
Right.
that layered approach and LLMs really react well to that, and that's kind of like the psychology of it, considering it's been trained on everything that humans have written about. So there is an
Yeah.
element of psychology in there. Cool. So it's good to hear you echo that. Okay, cool.
Yep. Absolutely. And so, once we analyze that goal, we have an agent that can make changes to the code base. I'll walk through kind of what that agent looks like. And once the agent, modifies the code base, like we encourage that agent to sort of like run tests and build and validate its work as it's going. And then we do a final step of validation. That could be running a set of unit tests. That could be like new unit tests that the agent added. It could also be just running a build, like running the TypeScript compiler to make sure, like, hey, this code will at least type check. Um, if that type checking passes, then we're going to push up the code to the Git branch that we've configured and start a new version of the agent so that the next time we clone a snapshot, it gets the new version of the source code that it can start working on and modifying.
So is this
Um,
vibe coding or chaos coding?
I would say this is full chaos coding. Yeah, there's no vibes or input from the humans living in meat space here. This is all, letting the agents decide what they want to do.
So this is like,
Um,
yeah, I just saw chaos coding talked about, and it was, yeah, just keep telling Claude 3.7, keep going, keep going, keep going.
keep
So,
going. Yeah,
which I think
that's
is neat.
effectively what this is. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick this off real quick, so that we can like start to see what's going to happen. And so you can see it is currently, so it cloned into the repo into this temp directory. And let me bump up a little bit. And we can see it's running like setup instructions, right? So it ran npm install, it found all my dependencies, it is running a build. And so, it successfully built the code base, and now it's actually like, this is the URL where it's running. And you can see the planning agent is starting to run tools. So it's listing the directory, it's looking at the package.json, it's looking at the index.ts file. And so let's go ahead and open this
Nice.
up, and we can see the discrete steps kind of starting to run, right? So it's running a chat completion through Anthropic. It's making a bunch of tool calls, right? So yeah, here's the output of like the ls command. One thing that I would mention is like this example has access to run arbitrary bash commands. So if anyone's going to try and do this at home,
I was
please
going to
run it
ask
in a
you about that.
sandbox. Yeah, run it in a Docker container. Like I am living
Uh,
life on the edge right now. I backed up my computer before this
Well,
event.
let me ask you
So
that. Like, so in the few
yeah,
years that I've watched this stuff and I've built my own stuff in PowerShell to have a PowerShell executor. And I was like, you know what? I don't care about Docker. I'm just going to let this fly. I have never seen it come up saying format my disk or do an RM
yeah.
star minus star or anything
No,
off
I would
else.
be I'm almost certain that in the post training runs, like Anthropic does post training runs on
Yeah,
SWE bench style benchmarks, like data for those, which includes tool calling for editing files for running bash commands. And I would be shocked if there was not training data in there with like negative cases to not run sudo rm-rf and things like that.
exactly.
So
Exactly.
I've never in practice run into problems with that, but like you are giving an agent access to your workstation to do anything.
And if you're
And
going to
so
give
I would
access to
just
your
say be very
databases,
careful.
and if you're going to give access to like database calls and stuff like that, absolutely. That's a little bit different, and
Yeah,
depending on your schemas and how you work. Somebody asked the question,
absolutely.
what is the test about? Do you give criteria?
Yeah, yeah. So um, in the most basic version of this agent, there's like a test command in the package.json that just runs a build. But the agent kind of has control over changing that like what's inside of that command. So we've had the agent do all sorts of stuff like set up prettier, set up ESLint. It's written new unit tests, and so the agent can kind of decide whatever it wants to do with that command.
Cool.
I think
Cool.
the other thing that's worth mentioning is that this code is going to cost us about $4 for like one iteration. So if we leave this
Which
running all day, it's going to end up costing hundreds of bucks. So be careful about that as well.
and what model? So what model are you using, and how many chat round trips do you think you're doing?
Yeah, good question. So it's on the order of like I want to say a million input
Mhm.
tokens, 2 million input tokens for one sort of cycle of the agent. And we're using Claude 3.7.
Okay, and the output tokens, I'm sure, are as much, if maybe a little
Output
less.
tokens are like an order of magnitude smaller, so like somewhere in the 100,000 to 200,000 neighborhood.
So that's going to be expensive, but
It's
that's not
expensive,
mean $100
but
for a day,
fun,
depending.
but
But
fun.
at
Yeah.
the end of the day, you get something that can take over the world. Why not?
Yeah, so our plan finished running, and let's see what's going on here. So, plan to improve the agent, modify the code base to improve AI agents' capabilities, actions to take, create a utility function for code analysis, right? Code analysis.tsx,
And
analyzing
this is
code
all what the
structure.
LLM came up with.
This is what the LLM came up with. Yeah, we'll look at
Sweet,
the code that does this in just a second. So, implement a cached file system. Wow.
amazing,
Okay.
amazing.
I don't think that's really necessary.
Nope,
Add a
but
code
cool.
templating system, enhanced error handling, automated testing capabilities, implement change verification system, add learning from past modifications. So,
Wow.
this is like incredibly ambitious, and I would be shocked if it could even do a tenth of this. Sometimes the agent, when it gets a little bit too ambitious, will push up a couple thousand lines of code with a bunch of to-dos. Sometimes it'll fix those to-dos on subsequent runs, but I would really prefer to see it be a little bit less ambitious.
Just to
I,
throw my a point in is that I've actually started with I use things like GitHub Copilot, and I use 3.7 lately with the agent ability turned on, and I'll come up with a spec.md, and I'll just say something. I want to come up with a to-do list, and I want to make sure that the CRUD implement operations are implemented, and that's
yeah,
it. Then I tell the agent, I say, read the spec.md and flesh it out, and it
yeah.
fleshes it out to like 7 pages, and it handles and talks about things like that and stuff like I would never even think to tell myself or somebody that. And then I say, go ahead and implement. And
Yeah, I
it's
think
just
like people
insane.
talk about vibe coding a lot, but I think that the two things that are most powerful for me, even more powerful than generating code, is that like, Cursor, Claude, it's the best, it's a rubber duck on steroids, right? It's like having a person in the room who you can talk through tough design challenges with. I love Cursor for API design in particular. I can say like, hey, I'm working on this implementation for like component caching in GenSX. Here are 3 ideas for APIs. Come up with 5 more and rank them based on like what's most elegant. And then, when I get the response back, I can say like, hey, I like a little bit of A and a little bit of C. Is there a happy medium there? Um, my other workflow that I really love is telling Cursor, you can't change code at all unless you're going to add logs. And so it's basically a debugging workflow. If I'm working on like a particularly hard problem, like identifying the source of a race condition or something like that, LLMs are not very good about reading and reasoning about like multi-threaded or parallel code on their own, in my experience. But they are very good at like processing 1,000 lines of logs and then saying like, oh, I kind of see what's going on here. We need a little bit more data from this part of the code base. I found that to be super, super
Mm,
effective.
awesome. So the two things you just said, I know you want to do more of your demo because the demo, I'm getting a ton of ideas, and it's one of the reasons I asked you to come demo. So thank you for that. Is that the human in the loop? This is becoming will become our newer where we fit, right? Being able to look and say, okay, can this thing debug parallelized code? Can it? I want
Yeah.
to get some new APIs, and I'm going to pick out the APIs I want. At some point, it might learn from us from memory, like what we like in names and how we have our style. But humans in the loop are going to be super important. But this is going to get automated away by LLMs, in my opinion. And I don't think we're too far from that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've
I think
even started.
the only question is how long is it going to take? Anyone's guess.
I think I brought up to the name Eric Meyer,
Yeah.
right? Co-creator of Haskell. He worked at
Yep.
Microsoft for 100 years. He did a whole presentation. He says LLMs, one of two things are true. It's the biggest scam that's ever been done, or we are the last generation to do manual coding. And he says, and he believes we're the last generation, so let's have fun. So I totally agree with
Yeah.
that. And hearing what your points, that what you've tried it for, I'm seeing that more and more. Chaos coding, vibe coding,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. Awesome. I'd like to really quickly for anyone, Dan, or maybe I'll just go ahead and drop this in the chat. So the agent implementation is based on this blog post that Anthropic put out about the post training that they did. that was like code editing and modification specific back in September. And my belief is that like this is the reason that Claude continues to stay on top as far as like code goes. And so this blog post, I encourage you to take a look at it. It describes, all of the tools that are used in the post-training run and basically everything that you need to build your own agent that modifies code. And we have a modified version of this code agent as described in the Anthropic blog post. And so I'll go ahead and switch over to the code real quick that does that. So, this is our kind of inner loop agent workflow. And so our workflow, anyone who's used React knows that there are these things called providers. Providers are how you provide things like credentials, configuration, like, if you need shared context that needs to be passed around a workflow, this is how you do it. So we have one provider that passes credentials into every component that needs to make chat completion requests. So you don't have to provide keys every time. Any chat completion that you run within this workflow will just automatically inherit the Anthropic credentials. And then we have a workspace provider that gives us sort of like all the, access to the temporary directory, commands to build the code base, push up changes to GitHub, other things like that. And so we have our, similar to what you saw on the screen, generate our goal state, generate our plan, modify our code, run final validation, and then finally we're going to like commit and push our results. And so I'll kind of, crack into like, the goal state generator. Um, Let's see. So, we have a component here that's like, basically decide if the goal is already achieved. And I think one thing that I skipped was we have this agent context file that's checked into the GitHub repo. And so this is kind of how the agent communicates with future versions of itself. So we give it an initial goal, modify the code base to improve your capabilities, yada, yada, yada. This is just like the decide on your own goal. And then we have a history array. And so initially this history array is empty, but every time the agent decides on a new goal, it's going to record that in the history. Every time it, tries something and fails or tries something and succeeds, it's going to record some history of the actions that it took. And then whether or not it succeeds and fails, it's going to push this file up to the Git repo so that subsequent versions have access to that history of commands. And so
Nice.
we have a component here that, you're an agent that decides whether or not the current goal has been achieved. We give it the goal state, we give it the history, we ask it to analyze, and then we return like, a chat completion that analyzes that goal state and just returns us like, this is structured output. So it just returns us like, a Boolean of whether or not it needs a new goal. And so once we've, decided on that goal state, we're generating our plan. And then I think the most interesting thing here is probably the modify code agent. So we have our code agent defined in here, which is, basically very simple system prompt with a couple of tools. So we have a tool for editing files, a tool for running bash commands, and then a tool for building our code base and running that final validation. And honestly, like that's about it, right?
Crazy. That's
The
it.
coding agent prompt is a little bit more complex, but I've uploaded, the repo in this directory path. Here are the set of instructions from the user. Here are the available tools that you have. Here are the steps that you're going to run. And so this is directly adapted from Anthropic's kind of blog post. And my understanding is that, Cursor, GitHub Copilot, Windsurf, all of them use a fairly similar version of this workflow for their composer and agent workflows. It's a 30-line prompt, a couple of tools, and then they let it run until completion. And there's more work that goes in under the scenes of like managing that context window, both for cost and, to make it fast. You're going to see our agent takes about 7 seconds to run. Cursor only takes 30 seconds, 20 seconds, something like that. And that's because they're being very, very careful with like what context and how much context they're providing into the agent.
So you're just basically, you're the magician that's telling the other magicians tricks that are going on. Awesome.
Yeah.
I like that. Question on the tools that you have for like Bash. Are they just, is it that like just a general prompt that you have? Do you have specifics about, I know you said that you let it run, it could run off the rails, but just curious how you set that, how
Yeah,
you,
so this is a direct translation of what is in the Anthropic blog post. So you can
sweet.
read the command here.
Awesome.
And so I think the really interesting thing, and the like maybe another little bit of secret sauce, is that because Anthropic wrote this blog post where they document specifically what tools they used in the post training run, like what prompts, the name of the tools. My understanding is that all of the big players go as far as to use the same names for the tools because it's in the training data, and so it's trained to select tools of this name for a particular task. Yes, like I'm sure everybody's customizing, the way that the tools work and,
Right.
adding their own guardrails and, lots of branching and things there. But it works remarkably well out of the box.
That's awesome. I saw one tool which I tried to port, and what was really interesting, it was a Kubernetes tool, a whole bunch of different things. And the only thing they had in the prompt was, is if you can't figure something out with Kubernetes, here's the different Kubernetes pieces you call with -H. And
Oh
so
yeah.
basically, and I think all the help documentation for all these tools
Yeah.
are in the training data. So I was like, wow, that's a really brilliant approach. And I started
Yep.
applying it, and I was like, for like things like, AZ CLI for Azure, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is just
Yep.
insane. This is the way to go.
You can I have had success wrapping CLIs with just like one tool call that's like that's like, how do I run a command, right? Like give me the name of the CLI and then the arguments effectively, and then the other one is the help command, and that gets you an awful long way.
It's
um
it's mind-boggling. Do you know the name Steve Yagi? I'm sure you know him.
yes.
So he's coming out with a book, him and Gene Kim. But he was also talking about, he's like, yep, I'm up all night and I'm playing with Claude Code. And he
Oh
basically,
yeah,
I
I
don't know if you
saw.
saw his post, and he just basically said, all of our tools, including Cody and Copilot and Aider and Cursor AI, he goes, Claude Code makes our stuff look antiquated. So I'm
Yep.
like, this is going to be fun. I'm in.
Ah, bummer. Oh no, we got an internal server error from Anthropic, and it crashed our agent. Oh,
Oh,
it's a
wow.
bummer.
What was
Well,
the internal error?
just a 500 from Anthropic. Anyone who's built
Uh,
on top of this stuff knows that, Anthropic is, all of the LLM providers. We have a Slack channel that's hooked up. We have a Slack channel that's hooked up to like all of the status APIs, and I swear, like every 15 minutes there's a new incident for a new provider. um
so how do
so
you have you run this with local LLMs and had different, I know obviously that it's not not
no,
that good,
I
but
don't use local LLMs. I'm fine with paying for the performance and the convenience. But let me go ahead and pull up a, let's see, agent successful code update. Like I'll pull up a commit that the agent made on a different branch that I made this. Like, let's see what the agent context was for this one. So this is not a super ambitious change, just, only 300 lines of code. So based on my exploration of the code base, well, actually, it looks like we have like several commits here. So let's maybe look at the first agent run here. Oh, this is a much more ambitious change. So the agent pushed up 2,200 lines of code. We can go look at the agent context file to see what it added to the history. So, action, generated execution plan, that action was successful. So create a detailed plan. Let's see, create a caching system for file operations. Okay, well, it tried to do that one on our first run too. So maybe we need to add a little bit of like randomness or increase the temperature to get it to come up with new goals. Um, all right, so modification changes to made. Create a caching system that stores file contents, add cache invalidation logic, implement methods to prefetch commonly accessed files. Okay, very interesting. So it's going to store files in memory that it likes to access. Okay, so then it attempted our code modifications. The
that
code
seems like
modifications was successful.
premature optimization, but go ahead.
Premature optimization. And it's actually funny is like, in the blog post, like, that's kind of the conclusion that I come to at the end here. It's like, I ask like, uh, are our jobs safe, right? And to me, it does, like, the agent does, and remind me an awful lot of like the median junior developer. It it needs very clear instructions to succeed. It needs frequent check-ins, and when left with vague
Mm.
guidance, it kind of does one of two things. Like, one, it either starts, just linting and refactoring the code and pushing things around, but not really having a whole lot of impact. Or it's way too ambitious, tries to bite off way more than it can chew, and will litter the code base with, 2 dozen to-dos and NYI exceptions.
Awesome. It's like a
Yeah,
typical set of developers. You got the
typical set
folks
of
that said,
developers. Yeah, it's
I
not,
refactored
not all that.
everything, and the other person says, "Hey, I spent 3 weeks on a caching piece. It didn't work. I'll go back, figure it out." That's cool.
Yeah. And so let's see, like,
That's
we'll just kind
awesome.
of walk through here. So it said like, hey, modification successful, made 5 major improvements, and it recorded and pushed this up into the Git branch. So we look at some of the changes it made. Okay. So it updated the bash tool schema to include like a cache implementation, right? Whether or not to update the cache
Interesting.
for any files modified by this command. It added a cache manager. Like, let's see. So we created a file cache that uses a map, getting the instance of the map, and then, like, setting paths. So like this actually looks legit to me. Like, this looks like roughly a reasonable cache. It has staleness checks. Like, this is pretty crazy. Prefetch schema. Okay, directory, max depth, pattern.
And
This is
once it
pretty
gets
wild.
checked in, this is after the tests are run, right? So the tests
Yeah.
pass, then it checked it in. Sweet.
Pass and checked it in, and then we had this subsequent run, right? I found that while the previous goal stated that several improvements were made, caching system, code analyzer, test analyzer, these components don't actually exist in the file system. It seems that the agent reported success without actually implementing the changes. Now I'll propose a new goal that addressed this issue by providing concrete improvement of the code base. Okay, so it seemed to get confused here and not realize that the cache manager exists. Um, oh no, it updated the existing cache manager. Interesting.
So do you use the whole thing of, the three checks, like, hey, we have somebody, we have the supervisor, so to speak, the code, the checker, the judge. Do you use those kind of different agents or techniques in the way you're approaching building this, or this was just something that you were, what showing what's you're capable of doing with your framework?
Yeah, I think, it's all, yeah, I've used all of these patterns in production before, like, not for generating, modifying code, but for other use cases. Especially in like using LLM as judge for evals and things like that. Um, so yeah, I think these are all patterns that when you spend enough time building deep LLM agents, you'll reach for eventually. And I feel like that's a huge benefit, for us in building this framework, is that we do have an awful lot of experience building agents and shipping them to production. Like, we've been in the trenches doing this, and so we understand sort of like what that end game is. And we design the framework to grow with you as your complexity scales, if that makes
Gotcha.
sense.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So how can folks find out more about what you offer, how you offer it, and I'm sure it's on your
Yeah, so
page. And
so so first thing I would say, yeah, GenSX it's open source and Apache 2.0 license. So, I'll drop a link onto the GitHub repo, and, if you want to follow along and support us, like, give it a star, and, watch for new updates. In addition, the website, it's just gensx.com. We have a Discord where we have a community of folks who are, building AI agents and, doing all sorts of fun things. So if you're interested in getting involved, like, there's a link to the Discord up here. Yeah, and on Twitter, I'm also, I believe at underscore Evan underscore Boyle as my Twitter handle, or
Mhm,
X
mhm.
handle. So
You're old school. The so do you think LLMs and AI is a fad?
No, I don't think it's a fad. There's certainly a lot of hype. There, sky high valuations. But like, what I would say is like even if there is a bubble, like there was at one point an internet bubble, there was like a dot-com bubble, right? Did the internet go away when the dot-com bubble burst? Like
I
no,
lived through
it's
that.
here to stay.
That was fascinating. It was almost like when we always related it to the tulips in
Yeah.
Holland. So, and it was
Yep.
exactly that. I mean, people were like, people at the cab drivers were like, "Hey, so what stocks you invested in? You invested into the pets.com?" It's like, "Oh, dude, get me out of yeah, I'm done." So yeah, there's a bubble, and yeah, we're gonna get through this, and it's gonna be even better.
I don't know if I would say there is a bubble. I'm just saying even if
Absolutely.
there was, I don't think there is. I think this is all real. There's a lot of like real world. The world is changing here in front of us. But even if there was, AI is not going anywhere.
Awesome. Anything else you wanted to
I would
add?
love to yeah, well I'd love to hear sort of like questions from folks in the audience about the approach, about building agents, about this agent. And the only other thing that I'd sort of like to mention is I'll allude to kind of what's next with GenSX. The last thing I'll share here is a link to this blog, and you mentioned like what is sort of surprising to folks when they try out the framework or when they see the framework. I think that like React is the thing that's like surprising to people, a React like programming model. And so we wrote this blog post that goes through in depth sort of like a response to the no framework movement, how we got here. And like, there's a lot of, I'm sure you've seen these too, Doug. Like, there's a lot of commentary out on Hacker News and Reddit on like, people getting frustrated with frameworks, what they get wrong, why our approach is different. And where this project is going in the end is we're building a durable execution engine on top of the framework. And so these agents, like this agent that I ran locally, it ran for 7 minutes, right? Like it had a failure that we like need to retry. And the framework in your runtime should just handle that for you. And I think it's really interesting to think about how the set of like infrastructure and cloud resources that the internet was built on in the last 20 years has a totally different set of assumptions than the infrastructure needed for the LLM first world, right? P99 latency for an API request in the Web 2.0 days is what, like 500 milliseconds? If you're P9 if you're P1 latency in today's world, if you're making an API call to Anthropic or OpenAI, even if you get a cache hit, it's going to be 2 or 3 seconds. It violates every assumption that we've made about what infrastructure is required.
Absolutely. The I mean, I've been worked on Wall Street for decades, and we don't even talk about things we talk about sub-millisecond, milliseconds to get trades done at high frequency trading.
Yeah,
So there's, and like, oh well, how do we apply that to LLMs? But so Andrew has a question. Do you want to read it or I can read it? Whichever
yeah,
you
sure. What
um
advice would you give to a beginner programmer in software engineering pertaining to the future of coding? What models or languages would you recommend to learn? How would you prepare for a career in software development? This is a very interesting question. Um, you know, I think what I would say is that I think AI is going to mean that the bar for like junior candidates is gonna go up, and so the expectations going into job interviews are going to be higher because of like what these tools can produce on their own. I think that's a real challenge and something that like we probably just all need to embrace. Like it's a reality. It's here. Um, I would say on the on the tool side of things, I I haven't really landed on this, but I see a big challenge, right? Like a big challenge with like vibe coding is you can prompt your way to pretty extreme results, right? And I'm sure we've all experienced this. Like if you spend a couple of days vibe coding something, or even a couple of hours vibe coding something, your coding muscle starts to atrophy a little bit, right? And then the moment that you hit a really, really tough bug, it's like you've been in a cast for 3 months and the doctor takes it off and suddenly you've got this shriveled arm and you have to learn like hand-eye coordination again. And so I think for new people coming into software engineering, there's going to be a real balance of like, how do I embrace the existing tools but make sure that I still have like fundamentals around, data structures and design and other things like that. Like I feel like the job of like a programmer these days is to review the code that's been generated by an AI. And if you're a senior engineer or principal engineer, this is what you're already doing in your job day to day. Is you're reviewing code of like people on your team. But if you're just coming into software engineering and you don't have as much experience reviewing code, like that's a challenge. And so I don't have a great answer for it, but I do think it's really important to focus on the balance of both.
I totally
Overall,
agree.
biggest piece of advice that I would give though, and I think this was true 5 years ago, this is true today, this will be true in 5 years. The best thing that you can do is build as much as possible, like hands on. You see a new model come out, go play with it, right? You see something like the responses API come out. It's not that hard to build a demo app. You can do it in 15-20 minutes. And it might take you a little longer the first time you do it, but just keep building, keep tinkering. And when something is driven by curiosity and love of the game, it's easy. It doesn't feel like work.
Totally agree, but I also add the Steve Yeagy's harsh point of view. It's the death of the junior coder, and I think you probably saw the article, and he talks about even in the legal space, right? They can actually go
Yeah,
through stuff that used to take teams 6, 7, 8 days or plus, get it done in an hour, and then they have a bunch of senior people look over the results, and they're like, "Well, what's going to happen with the interns?" He says, "We don't need them." And then it's like, "Well, how are you going to get new
yeah,
lawyers?" And there's no
yep.
answer to how do you get new lawyers out of that.
No, I agree with you. I was trying to take a slightly more positive tact
I
for our friend here on like that's what I meant by the expectations of junior engineers are higher, right? And I think that the way that this plays out in practice is that like often when you bring a junior engineer on board, you're like mentoring them and hoping that they're gonna rise and become a leader on the team. And so you delegate tasks to them, but the set of tasks that you might have once delegated to them that are going to take them a day and require some mentorship and things like that. I can take that task and myself delegate it to an LLM, review the code, and be done in 15 minutes. So now the trade-off is like, well, do I want to manage an additional 2 or 3 people, or do I just want to do those tasks myself? I think this is not long term. Like long term, we're going to figure all of this out. But I think in the short term it means that the expectations of anyone coming on to the team are going to be that you have more self-sufficiency, that you're fluent in these AI coding tools. And so it's a challenge that everyone coming into the job market is going to have to adapt to until we all figure this out.
and just to circle back to your point, it's all about it, it is about curiosity. I mean,
Yeah,
you have to be willing when you type in your thing, like if you go up to an LLM, like if you go up to Grok 3, I think even today, and you say, "Hey, how much is 4,305, 4357.12345 times 3421.87654?" It's going to give you a number. It's going to hallucinate it.
yeah.
And yeah, you can sit there and go, "Oh, this thing can't even do math." Well, you got to push past that and begin to figure out, well, how do I prompt? How do I work with that? Do I need to use a different model, right? Do I need to use OpenAI with code interpreters, so on and so forth? And these are the things you need to learn so you can get good at this process so that you can do a job for companies or startups or whatever you're going to get involved with.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I learned a lot. I appreciate it. I hope folks did learn. Not too many. Any other questions that we might want to field? This was great. And
I would just love to thank the PowerShell community for letting me come and talk about TypeScript. Really appreciate it, folks.
really glad to have you. Always good to see a different set of languages and you planting seeds about these possibilities and knowing there's a tool out there that we can walk up to and start using is great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays and hope to see you back here next time. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, folks. Have a good one.